We are back with the Inside the Block podcast, celebrating all the different businesses of the warehouse block, and I am here with not James Franco,
No.
Derek DeFranco,
Yeah.
head master brewer of Mirror Twin Brewing. And tell us about the brewing process, because we're here like in the actual warehouse. Is that what you're calling this?
Yeah, so we call this the brewery.
The brewery.
So we actually have been brewing over here since 2021. We started in our 725 location where the main tap room is. And we were actually brewing in the back part of it. And we started on a little 3-barrel system. It was basically like a glorified homebrew system. And we had 10 3-barrel fermenters and then a 3-barrel mash tun and boil kettle. So in layman's terms, it's about 100 gallons.
Okay. At a time.
Yeah, at a time.
At a time, okay.
And so we had 10 fermenters, and that's kind of why when we opened, we started with 10 different beers. And then we slowly started upgrading the 3-barrel fermenters into 7 barrels and 10 barrels, and we were just doing multiple batches of the same beer into the bigger tanks in order to make more product. Because the one thing that we struggled with from the very beginning when we opened was just keeping beer on tap, because we could only make so much at a time. And so we did that for a while, and then in 2018, we expanded to a 15-barrel system. So you go from making 100 gallons at a time to almost 500. And so that's actually the system
that was a big jump.
Yeah, it was a big jump.
Yeah.
And part of the reason was when you're looking at buying a new system, the cost difference between one size to the next doesn't get, like, it's not that much bigger.
Not worth
from like
it.
a 10-barrel system to a 15, the price isn't that much different until you start getting into like really big systems. And so we're still over at the 725 building, so we're
you're still
limited
brewing
on
over
space.
there
Yeah,
too? Oh, okay.
Well, no, not anymore. I'm
Okay.
talking about in 2018
Gotcha.
when we upgraded this system. And so what we were trying to wrestle with was we wanted to get the biggest system that we could not only afford, but also we could fit into that space. And so that's why we ended up settling with the 15-barrel. And so we bought our 15-barrel system and then 3 30-barrel fermenters, and then we also had some 10-barrel fermenters that we were brewing into as well. And then the pandemic happened. It was kind of difficult. No one really knew how to navigate it, but we did our best. And then once things started opening up a little bit more, we got really busy, especially because they let us keep what was a parking lot and we turned it into a patio space. And so all of a sudden, we just couldn't make enough beer. And so we had actually leased this building in 2018, and we were using it as storage. And it just made sense to move everything over here. And so Chad Walker initiated the process. We got the building rezoned with a lot of their help. And in 2020.
Oh, it had to take another zoning to be able to brew beer.
Yeah, because
interesting.
to brew beer alone without a restaurant, it has to be zoned industrial, and it was zone B4. So we went through the process, got it rezoned, and then proceeded to go through the licensing with the TTB, which is the federal organization that licenses breweries, and then went through the state licensing process as well.
Cool.
So we moved everything over here, and then we also bought 9 new tanks, and it increased our capacity from being able to do about 140 barrels at a time to 350 barrels at a time. So it a little bit more than doubled our capacity. And then we also upgraded our canning line in order to keep up with producing.
Oh, so this is canning.
Product. Yeah.
Ah.
So normally what I like to do is kind of take people through the brewing process.
Yeah, that'd be great.
And because it's interesting how much
people don't know.
Well, and like how much more of an appreciation you get for that, that pint of beer when you see all that goes into it.
Absolutely.
So the first process of brewing starts with malted grain. And so That big steel tank that you see out front, that is our silo, and it holds 48,000 pounds of 2-row barley, and that is basically the heart of most beer. That's what we call a base grain. It's what makes up most of what beer is, and then we throw in specialty malts, but most of that is still 2-row, it's just malted differently. So what we do is we take that grain and we mill it in order to basically access the inside part of it, which is where all the starches are. It's called the endosperm, and we want to keep the husk still intact. And so our mills are pretty specific, and we can actually adjust how much we crush the grain, and there's kind of a science to it. You want enough of the husk intact so you get what's called filterability, but you want enough of the endosperm exposed so you get good conversion.
Sperm in beer.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
So that's where all the sugar is, right?
Okay. Good to know.
Where the magic happens, and
so to speak.
so to speak. So we run it through our mill. It goes into a tank called a grist case, and we normally mill in the day before just to make things easier. And it sits in here until we do a process called mashing in. And so what we do is we'll take the grain and we'll auger it into the vessel here, which is called a mash tun.
Okay.
And we mix it with hot water. And so it goes through that little device up there called a grist hydrator. And as you can see, we have rakes that spin and kind of help stir it up.
Yeah.
So when we first started, didn't have that. I mashed in with a drill and a mud mixer.
Like by hand? Oh my gosh, okay.
Yeah. And
so this is an upgrade.
Yes, a lot of big upgrade.
Yeah.
And so the grain mixes with the hot water, and what that hot water does is it starts to activate enzymes that were created in the malting process.
Okay.
And those start to break down the starches, the complex carbohydrates, into simple carbohydrates.
Okay.
And this process is really important because that's what the yeast can ferment and then turn into ethanol.
Okay.
And so we call this process mashing, or more specifically, the saccharification rest. And so once we've got all the grain and the water mixed, we let it sit for an hour. And that's when the hot water activates those enzymes.
Magic happens.
Yes.
Yeah.
The enzymes break down the starches. And we basically have this like sugary liquid we call wort. W-O-R-T, not what
like,
witches get.
Yeah,
and,
gotcha, on their nose, yeah.
And so you can see here, there's actually a false bottom. It's basically like a bunch of grates.
Oh, okay.
And so the grain sits on top of this and allows us to separate the liquid from the grain.
Gotcha.
Kind of like you would make tea, right? You don't want a bunch of tea leaves in
so
your
it's
tea.
steeping, and then you're pulling out the grain. Yeah, okay.
And so once we're done letting it sit for an hour, we'll actually start to separate the liquid from the grain. And it goes into this little device. It's called a grant. Ours is Amy Grant.
Love it.
And
a classic 90s too, yeah.
So we separate that liquid. So the grant's purpose is if you can kind of see that the system is relatively level. And without the grant, at some point we'd have to start pumping the liquid over, but it would pull down on the grain bed, and it would pull a bunch of grain through. So the grant, if you notice, is about a foot shorter than where the mash tun bottom is.
Yeah.
And so it allows us to gravity feed into this vessel and pump from here instead of pumping directly from the mash tun. It's actually like an older technology that they brought back. And so we set the liquid, gets separated, goes into here, and we pump it out into the right vessel, which is our boil kettle.
Okay. This one, this big one?
Yeah.
Okay.
And as we're doing that, we also spray the grain with hot water. We call that process sparging, but really what we're trying to do is we're trying to get as much sugar out of the grain as possible. And so it's like rinsing it. So once we pumped all the liquid over to our kettle, the normal volume that we're trying to get in our kettle is about 500 gallons. And from that point, we start to boil it. And we boil it for a couple different reasons. One, it allows us to add hops, which adds bitterness. And that's important because without that balance, beer would be a little too sweet. It also sanitizes the liquid, make sure that there's no outside bacteria or foreign yeast. the boiling process kills all that. And then it also reduces the sugar a little bit more. And again, trying to get as much sugar out of the liquid as possible makes making beer a little bit cheaper. It makes the process a little bit more efficient. And so boiling it allows us to do that.
Here's a dumb question for you. What is hops?
So hops are actually a flower.
Okay.
Genetically, they're pretty similar to marijuana, but they have oils in them that, when exposed to heat, isomerize, which is just to say that the bitterness gets really concentrated, and they are relatively inexpensive as opposed to other methods of bittering, and they also have they're preservative as well.
So they're doing lots of things.
Yeah. And what's cool is, as hops became more popular, they started growing different varieties, and then they took those varieties and started making different varieties with those. And so when I first started brewing, there was 20, 30 different hops. Now there's hundreds of different varieties. And there's also like different substances, like they make concentrated hop oils that are a little bit better for like commercial brewing, because we don't get as much loss and everything. So hops are critical. Even when people say I don't like hoppy beers, hops are still in every beer.
Every beer.
Because we need to bitter the liquid somehow, and hops are just the most efficient way to do that.
Cool.
So they also all have different flavor profiles, and when you utilize them in the process has a lot to do with what kind of flavor profile
Like at what
you get.
time you introduce
Yeah.
it? Gotcha.
So when we add hops right at the beginning of when we start boiling, and for most of our beers we boil for 60 minutes as well, you're going to get a lot of bitterness. The later you add in the boil, the more aroma and flavor you're going to get.
Okay.
And then we even add hops directly into our fermenters sometimes, where there's no boiling, to really get that aroma enhanced. And so, hops, they're in every single beer. They're critical to the process and the flavor profile of every beer we make.
Cool.
So from that point,
Okay.
once it's done boiling, we'll actually do something called whirlpool the beer. Most of the time I don't talk about this in tours because it's kind of, no one really cares, but it's interesting in the process.
Yeah, for sure.
So what we actually do is we will we'll spin the wort. So we have this tangential port here. It's just called a whirlpool arm. And so what we do is we pull the liquid from the bottom of the kettle, goes through a pump, and then gets pumped back in.
Okay.
And it makes the wort spin. And the reason we do that is so we'll do that for about 5 minutes, and then we'll let it sit. And as it's basically creating a vortex, all of the heavy sediment, like the hop particulate, some grain husks that got through the false bottom, all that stuff starts to settle at the bottom in a cone. So then when we pull the liquid to go into our fermenters, it's not pulling all that stuff through.
Gotcha.
So from this process on, I'm gonna let my head brewer, Mike Brown, take over.
Let's definitely meet him.
Yeah.
Great. He's also head brewer? You're co-head brewers?
I'm the master brewer technically.
Okay.
And then he's the head brewer.
Okay.
As far as like rank goes, like I'd be like the general. He's like
Head lieutenant?
yeah,
Colonel?
whatever's
What is the Come on, Brandon.
Oh, no.
We can
But-
get you mic'd up too.
We all, all the brewers, we work together. It's a hierarchy in a sense for,
Yeah.
employment reasons.
Of
but
course.
We always work really well together. We make decisions together. And one of my brewers, Doug, he's been with me from the very beginning. And so is Mike. Mike started off bartending and then eventually moved into the brewery.
Yeah.
And we've just, when you spend so much time
Totally.
with people, you kind of become family. And so we're very in sync. We're always on the same page with things, and it's nice to have people that you work well with together.
Totally. And anticipate what you would do if you weren't there. And
Yeah.
I mean, that's just key.
So
Very
and
cool.
it makes it more fun.
Yeah.
You know? We all have similar personalities, and we like the same things and jokes. And,
What do you like? What do y'all
I
have in
like to
common?
annoy them with really bad dad jokes.
Okay, awesome,
Yeah,
great.
and they love it.
Mm-hmm.
But like we all like Rick and Morty.
Okay, great.
Which we know it's a show on
Yeah.
Cartoon Network,
Uh-huh.
and you know, we're all just kind of goofy. You know, we don't take things too seriously, and I think that's why we work really well together.
Cut from the same cloth.
And you know, when we
like
come
that.
in here, you know, we know like, let's get the job done, especially on the really hot summer days where it's in the hundreds.
Yeah.
It gets about 10 to 15 degrees warmer in here than outside because we've got, you know, our kettle going. We use a lot of 180 degree water to sanitize our lines and our tanks and all that stuff. And so there's always steam in here, and it can get pretty miserable. And so sometimes, you know, we come in really early in the morning to try to beat that heat.
Yeah, you were telling me the other day that you guys come in the summers at like 6 a.m. Like you have to.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes, you know, most of the time it's actually closer to like 4 or 5.
Wow.
So
Yeah.
I think we all kind of like coming in here by ourselves a little bit early in the morning because, one, I feel like we get the most done because you can just, you know, kind of power through it without any distractions. But, you know, it's nice to kind of have that solitude, and, you know, you just by yourself, and, you know, you're putting, you know, listening to music, you know, with your, or my AirPods or a podcast, and you're just doing stuff.
Knocking it out.
But then it's like, man, I wish I had another set of hands.
Yeah, that would help too.
But,
At 4 in the morning. Whirlpool.
So, what did he say about Whirlpool?
That it goes into this machine and something about sanitizing, and then it goes down into.
Derek, did you explain what Whirlpool is?
Yeah.
Definitely cut
All right.
that out, or it looked like
Okay,
I wasn't
okay.
listening.
Yep. All right.
Okay.
I just want to make sure.
Yeah.
Okay.
Whirlpool.
So Whirlpool, after the Whirlpool is done, we will let it rest. And since the liquid is spinning, as it rests, the solids kind of fall down into the middle of the kettle. So we want to get all the solid particulate out. So when we go to transfer, that solid particulate doesn't get into our heat exchanger and into our tank. We want clean liquid going into our tank.
Excellent.
So
Love to hear it.
the liquid coming out, we call wort. Derek probably explained that.
WORT, by the way.
W-O-R-T.
Yeah.
The good kind of wort.
Good kind of word.
So the kettle was at a boil. It's probably still 200, 205 degrees in there. And we need to get it into our tank, usually around 70 degrees. So the piece of equipment behind you is our heat exchanger.
Okay. Cools it down?
Yes.
Okay.
So this is like a radiator in your car. Exactly like a radiator in your car, actually. We have one of these tanks over here that is completely full of just RO water.
Okay.
We keep that water at 35 degrees so that we can run that cold water through our heat exchanger at the same time we run our 200 degree wort out. That way it cools it down to the 70 degrees that we want. When we're coming out of our heat exchanger, we'll run through this right here. That's our flow meter. That tells us how many gallons have gone through. It's got an impeller inside of it, and every revolution it counts how much has gone through there. That will track how much we are sending into our tank, and that way we know, okay, we had this many gallons in here. When we go to package, we have a better idea of how much is left in the tank. In our tank, it depends on what we're brewing for the day and what our plan is with that brew. But if we are brewing hazy IPAs, we usually have what we call a starter in the tank. And we've made 50 or 60 gallons of low gravity wort, and we've put our yeast in the tank already so that we give that chance of yeast to grow and get more active.
Like a sourdough starter.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly.
Gotcha.
Yep. So hazies, we only use one generation of yeast, and that's why we do the starter. We could buy a bigger pitch, but it would cost us more. So we buy a smaller pitch and make a starter.
Yeah.
So we let it grow itself up before we put the usually 400, 450 gallons of wort in there.
Got
other brews, we can have yeast pitched from another tank in line. So we'll either push yeast from a tank, or we can push yeast from a yeast brink. Basically a keg where we can harvest yeast into it from the tank and then push in line into the tank. With the hazies, we use a yeast called London Ale 3. It is a yeast that it doesn't flocculate well. Flocculation means to drop out of solution. So the haze you see in the New England IPAs is a lot to do with the yeast. So that non-flocculent yeast will stay in suspension very well, and that's why one of the reasons why they look so hazy. The other types of yeast that we might use are ale yeast or lager yeast, and we also use a champagne yeast. So
Fancy.
yeah, champagne yeast is for our ciders actually.
Okay.
That's the only thing we use it for. And
I like ciders.
Yeah, we make a lot more cider now than I ever thought we would.
Yeah, is it because it's like there's a demand for it?
Yeah, we were buying cider, Cider Boys mostly, some other brands too, and we were selling so much cider that
It's like, why wouldn't you make your own?
we tried it
Yeah.
one time and we're like, oh, okay,
Yeah.
let's keep doing this.
Yeah.
So champagne yeast for those.
Okay.
Almost all of our other flagships use the ale yeast, and we can use this same pitch of yeast multiple times. So we can get 10 to 20 tanks worth of beer from one pitch of yeast. We'll continue to harvest and pitch into the next, so that helps cut costs.
Yeah, I'm sure.
But that ale, or the ale yeast that we use, is called Chico. It is a very common yeast that lots of breweries use. It is a clean profile. It is very flocculent, so you'll notice that our non-hazy beers are clear. That's why that yeast drops out of solution very well. It has a clean fermentation, doesn't have a lot of lingering flavors from the yeast in particular. So it allows us to let the malt or the hops or whatever else we're putting in that beer shine. That was the third yeast. The fourth yeast that we use is a lager yeast. Everybody knows what lagers are. The process with the lagers is a little bit different. Lager yeasts like to be a lot colder. So they ferment, depending on what strain you use. We start our fermentation with lager yeast at 55 degrees instead of the 70 on the ales and the hazies.
Gotta be colder.
Yep. So we have to run through our heat exchanger colder or slower.
Oh.
So yep. But the lager yeast will ferment at 55. The lager yeast itself is a little harder to deal with just because of the colder fermentation. It doesn't propagate as well. So when we go to harvest from a lager yeast, there isn't as much yeast to harvest as there would be from our ale yeast. So we have to be a little more careful with our lager yeast to make sure that we are giving it the nutrients it needs, making sure that it has a healthy fermentation, that it grows well, so that the next time we go to use it, it's good to go. All that will happen in the tank after we transfer from our heat exchanger. So the fermentation process, we're going to use one of those yeasts, and like I said, we have moved our worts through our heat exchanger at our desired fermentation temperature, 70 or 55 or whatever that might be, into our tank. So in our tanks, you've got that the wort, the sugary pre-beer liquid.
They moved to these tanks.
Yes.
Okay, let's go.
Yeah.
Let's go look at these. And this is when you start adding in what?
So depending on the beer that we are making, there are a lot of different things we can do. So our brew system is a 15-barrel system.
Okay.
Derek probably explained
Yeah.
that. So all of these tanks are 15-barrel tanks.
Okay.
So when we brew into these tanks, it's one brew. When we brew into these tanks, these are 30-barrel tanks. It takes us 2 brews to fill them. The larger tanks over there are 60-barrel tanks on the other side. So it takes us four brews to fill those up.
Okay.
So once we have transferred out of our heat exchanger into our tank, so like this tank, You can see, or this one right here, actually. You see where it's bubbling like that?
Yeah.
So that bubbling is a sign of active fermentation. So inside that tank, there's the yeast and the wort. The yeast is eating the sugars from the wort. The yeast uses oxygen, nitrogen, and a few other nutrients. When it consumes that sugar, it turns it into alcohol and CO2. So the bubbles coming out are CO2.
Gotcha.
The alcohol content of whatever is in the tank is determined by how much sugar is left in that tank, in that solution.
Okay.
So when we go into our tanks, we will take a gravity reading, and that tells us how much sugar is in solution. We use specific gravity, so our readings will be 1.06 or 1.08 or 1.04. And the higher the number, the more sugar is in solution. So generally speaking, the higher that our starting gravity is, the more alcohol will be in that beer. So most of our hazies come out at 7%. So they go into our tanks around 1.07. They usually ferment down into the 1.014, 16, 18 range. And that gives us about 7% ABV. Our light lager, the Old Reliable, it goes into our tanks around 1.043. So it starts a lot lower and it ends usually around 1.004. So very low, very dry. And that'll get us at a 4% ABV. So when we're in the tank, the yeast is fermenting, it's doing its thing. We check gravities out of the tanks after we've brewed every day. We will record those gravities, we put them into our computer, and we can track fermentation to see how far along we are.
Yeah.
So ale fermentations, we can have an ale fermentation done within a week. So brew day, we check the next day, it's usually dropped a significant amount. The first and second day are usually the very heavy fermentation days. It kind of trails off after that. And as it's fermenting, the sugar content's getting lower, alcohol is going up. The yeast will start to flocculate out. It'll drop out of solution when it doesn't have anything to do. It doesn't have any more sugars to eat. So the sugars left in the beer, some of them are non-fermentable sugars. So any beer that we make with lactose. So like our milk stout, it has lactose, which is milk sugar. The yeast that we use cannot consume the milk sugar. So it stays in solution. And that's how we have sweeter beers. They'll end with a much higher gravity, much higher sugar content. The yeast will not consume those. The other sugars that yeast won't consume are very complex sugars. So we use a lot of oats, and you get a lot of complex carbohydrates out of those.
Totally.
The yeast can't completely break those down, so they stay in solution as well. There are a couple other factors we can use that control how much sugar is fermentable. When we mash in, I'm sure Derek talked about the temperature of the mash.
Yeah.
The higher the mash temperature, the more unfermentable sugar there will be. So the more sugar will be left in the final product. With the mash temperature, those unfermentable sugars, they don't always read as sweet. They can just read more as like a thicker, they can make the liquid seem thicker, more viscous, a creamier mouthfeel is what a lot of people say. Whereas in the opposite, those lagers that finish with very little sugar, very dry, very clean. So really depending on what kind of beer we're gonna make, we shoot for a starting gravity and finishing gravity to hit our ABV and our desired level of sugar in the final product. So let's talk about wheezing the juice. We make a lot of that. It's a fruited sour. It uses lactose. So we use tangerine, vanilla, lactose, and blood orange. Those are the 4 ingredients that we put into wheezing the juice that come on what we call the cold side. So hot side, brewing process. Once it passes that heat exchanger, we can add things. A lot of people refer to them as adjuncts. So any ingredient that we put into a beer that was not in the hot side process, and some that go into the hot side process are still adjuncts. But blood orange, tangerine, lactose, vanilla, those are all adjuncts we add to a beer. The lactose increases that final gravity, giving that wheeze in the juice a little thicker, a little sweeter mouthfeel. So with the wheeze in the juice, it's tart, a little sweet. It's 7% ABV, so it's got a lot going on. It's not one of those beers that we're wanting people to have 5 or 6 of. It's a very flavorful beer.
Sounds like a challenge.
You can do it. You do you.
Yeah, yeah.
But so.
How much security do we have here at Mirror Twin?
None.
None. Well, then I'm in.
Depends on what night. Let's see, where are we at? Wheeze in the juice.
Sorry.
All right, you're good. So usually when we make wheeze in the juice, we do a 30 barrel batch.
Okay.
We sell a lot of it, so we don't want to make a whole bunch of small batches. We'd rather make a big batch and let it last a little bit.
Is that the most popular beer, do you think?
It was about this time last year.
Okay.
And now Hazy But Lazy has become our most popular.
Hazy But Lazy. Gotcha.
Well, yes and no. Depends on what we're talking about, draft or cans or in tap house, out in distribution. They're all kind of different.
So your average person that comes to Mirror Twin though, like in-house, what do they order? Like what do you sell?
Our number one selling beer is White Girl Wasted.
White Girl Wasted, yeah.
It's our blonde.
Yeah.
It's light.
I was wondering when she was gonna come up.
It's a very approachable beer.
Yeah.
And that's been our flagship light beer from the very get-go.
Yeah. And can I ask you where the name came from?
You'll have to ask Derek.
Okay, sounds great. All right. Is there a story behind it?
Probably.
Okay, sounds good.
Derek came up with all the names when
I'm
we started.
really hoping that it's one particular white girl who got wasted.
So, no, I think it's just in general.
Like in general, like all the Us as a collective
We
whole.
don't take ourselves very seriously when it comes to naming beers.
I love that.
Obviously.
Yeah.
We like to have fun.
And I like that you have so many like small batches. I mean, like you'll brew for anybody essentially. Like like somebody could come in and be like, I really want. This is what I'm thinking. Can you make me like just like a batch that would look like this? Yeah.
So we've done collabs with Crank and Boom Ice Cream.
Yeah.
We've done collabs with. We actually have one coming up with North Lime Donuts.
Cool.
We've done Spalding Donuts beers. We use a lot of coffee from Nate's Coffee, and we'll do the collabs with them.
Yeah.
We've also had outside companies, most recently Lexmark. So Lexmark approached us. They have a farm. They have beehives on their farm, so they have honey. So honey is another form of fermentable sugar that gets used in beer.
Yeah.
So we made a honey blonde ale for them. It actually comes out today.
Cool.
It's called Solar Bee.
Solar Bee, love that.
So we used 15 gallons of their honey. We used 10 gallons in fermentation. We tasted it. It didn't quite have enough honey flavor for us, so we added another 5 gallons after fermentation to add a little more honey flavor.
Now, when you're making these batches, and it's not quite enough honey for you, or something wasn't quite, so what happens to that beer? Does it still get drunk?
So,
like the one that's not quite there yet, and you have to like redo. What happens?
No,
to
we
the
don't have to
leftover?
redo anything. We have.
You're just adding to it.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
Within reason. There's only so much you can do sometimes.
Yeah.
But when we tasted that one, we can obviously add more honey at any time we want.
Okay.
The only issue is that honey is fermentable. So we need to make sure that we prevent re-fermentation inside the cans, because it'll overcarbonate, it'll overpressurize, and it just lead to bad situations.
Sure.
But add more honey, add more flavor. We can add more vanilla. That's an easy add. We can add more fruit to beers. Those are all easy adds. Coffee. All of these things are very easy to add after fermentation just to bump flavors. So we'll taste before we package things, and if something doesn't have enough flavor, we'll add something to it. Or in some cases, it doesn't taste sweet enough. We can add a little more vanilla. Vanilla gives off a sweetness.
Oh, totally.
Like all desserts, all pastries, everything vanilla.
So good.
Vanilla gives its own perceived sweetness. So that's an easy add.
Now, are you guys the only ones that are tasting these things? Do you have like some sort of a program where people can come in and help out? Because I'm available at all times.
We appreciate all input.
Even the people that just want free beer?
So really, honestly, there are just 3 of us back here.
Gotcha. Yeah. You got 3 pallets that are like turning out all of this beer for Lexington. I love it.
Prefer more pallets.
Yeah. But I think it's great.
Because the 3 of us, we know
What
how
you're
we
doing?
taste things.
Yeah.
Well, we know how we taste things.
Yeah.
Some of us taste other flavors better than others.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So if we're looking for off flavors in a beer, one of the main off flavors is called diacetyl. Doug is very good at picking up diacetyl, and it's just about like the chemistry of your palate, like the way your tongue's built,
Totally.
and like just some people think cilantro tastes like soap.
Yeah.
It's the same concept.
Right.
Doug is very good at picking up diacetyl.
What are you good
Some
at?
of us aren't. I'm pretty good at diacetyl and acetaldehyde.
Of course. Yeah.
So, acetaldehyde.
Me too.
Acetaldehyde. One of the best-selling beers in this country, probably the best-selling beer in this country, has acetaldehyde in it on purpose. It is a very small dosage, and it gives it its unique flavor.
Are we talking about like a popular beer
Yeah.
out there? Gotcha.
Yeah. Like the most popular.
Okay.
beer.
Gotcha. Does it start with like a B?
Yeah, it might.
Like Schmudweiser, something like that.
like
Okay.
that.
Oh, gotcha.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
You keep going.
So, it. To what I was saying about it gives its own unique flavor. You could give the same recipe, same ingredients to 10 different breweries. They make beer. It's going to taste different coming out of all those breweries just because of their processes and the way they do things. So they do a couple things different that creates that acetaldehyde, and it gives it that unique flavor. And that's how they kind of set themselves apart, because every light beer is so close to each other that
Totally.
you need a little something to stand out.
Differentiate.
Yeah.
Totally.
Yeah.
I could see that.
Let's see what else we got. So we talked about fermentation.
Yes.
We
Talked about White Girl
talked
Wasted.
about White Girl Wasted.
Yeah.
Let's talk about IPAs and hops, because we haven't really talked
Let's
about
do
it.
that. Yes.
We make a lot of IPAs.
Yeah,
A lot
which
of
is
hazy
a
IPAs.
very polarizing flavor, right? You
Yes.
either love it or hate it.
Yep. When I got into craft beer, it was in college. I hated IPAs.
Yeah.
I started off obviously drinking very terrible light beer, like everybody else.
Yeah.
When I finally made it into craft beer, stouts were my thing. I wanted a lot of flavor, but I didn't like that bitter hoppiness, and it took me a while to get into it. But yes, IPAs are polarizing, but they are still the number one beer style for craft breweries. IPAs,
Really?
for sure. Yep.
Yeah.
Sierra Nevada's pale ale. It's a pale ale. It's not an IPA, but it's hoppy. It's
Yeah.
got some bitterness to it. All of the New Belgium, the Voodoo Rangers, and things like that. IPAs are very popular. So hops are very popular. That's the main flavor in IPAs. With hops,
Which is a plant, by the way.
yes,
Yeah. I just learned that. Yeah.
hops are an agricultural product. So just like grain, they can change from year to year, from crop to crop, from farm to farm. So
It can taste different year
yep,
after year then.
yep.
Okay.
You're kind of, yeah. So hops, there are hundreds of different hops. It's kind of like, I grow peppers.
No.
There are a lot of peppers. There's hundreds of different peppers.
Yeah.
Super spicy, super sweet, somewhere in between. It's kind of the same with hops. So you can have very tropical hops. You can have very dank hops. And you can have some very floral, like less aggressive flavor profiles from hops and aromas. So depending on the beer we're making, we'll use different hops for that. Our IPAs are obviously hop forward. We want whatever hops we're using to stand out. So let's talk about our Monster series.
Okay.
So like Citra Monster, Mosaic Monster. We've probably made 20 to 30 different Monsters. Those are all single hop New England IPAs. So all of those Monster series our base beer. It's brewed the exact same way, exact same recipe, and then we just dry hop with different hops. So Citra Monster is all Citra hops. Mosaic Monster is all Mosaic hops. If you taste those two right next to each other, the only difference in those is the aromas and the flavors of those hops. So Citra hops are obviously very tropical citrus flavors. Mosaic hops can be a little bit more earthy, a little more floral, a little more blueberry sometimes. But depending on where hops are grown, they have different flavor profiles. A lot of New Zealand hops, Nelson Sauvin, Motueka, some of those. Galaxy is grown in Australia. They all have different flavor profiles because of where they're grown.
Yeah.
Just like grapes with wine.
Sure.
So with our New England IPAs, we don't use any hops on the hot side. So we essentially get no bitterness, and we only dry hop. So at the top of these tanks, there is a 4-inch port.
Okay. Oh, I see it, yeah.
Yep. While we are fermenting, usually with our New Englands, 2 days in, we'll open that port and we'll drop hops in the top. It's called dry hopping.
Yeah.
So with our New Englands in a 15 barrel, we'll add 44 pounds of whatever hop. So for the Monsters, we'll add 44 pounds of Citra hops into the top of this tank while it's fermenting. While that's fermenting, obviously there's some convection, there's a lot of mixing, so those hops go in and it can be a little turbulent. You'll notice after we dry hop, the bucket bubbles very vigorously. A lot of CO2 coming out of solution.
Yeah.
But those hops and the yeast interact mid-fermentation. Biotransformation is a very nerdy thing that was brought up.
No.
Yeah, a little. But it's
So much science to all this.
When New England became popular, biotransformation was a big topic of discussion.
Okay. Like whole conferences you guys went to about
Well,
this,
nobody
and
knew.
It was right next to Comic-Con, right?
Probably. Nobody really knew why New England's stayed cloudy at first. There's a lot of science that's happened since then over the last 5 or 6 years. But biotransformation was one of those things that everybody thought there's some interaction between the yeast and the hops. The science hasn't been figured out yet, but that's what keeps that haze in those
But New
beers.
England is incredibly cloudy just in general. Is there any
Yeah.
correlation between that?
Yes.
Yes.
Maybe clam chowder.
Yeah. Love it. The cloudiest of them all.
New England's get dropped 2 days in.
All right.
Our West Coast IPAs and our pale ales, we'll wait till fermentation's almost over. That way we can pull yeast from those again, and then we'll dry hop after fermentation. It's basically done.
Cool.
So we'll dry hop our West Coast and our pale ales probably like 7 to 10 days in, as opposed to 2 days in with the New England IPAs. And that is mainly for us to be able to harvest that yeast and be able to use it again, and also for clarity. Where we dry hop the New England so early, it's going to add some haze that we want in a New England that we don't want in our West Coast and our pale ales. So after we dry hop, we'll track the fermentation. When it's done fermenting, we'll do what's called cold crash. And this goes for every beer, not just our dry hop beers. When fermentation has ended, we'll cold crash. And when I say ended, we check our gravity every day. When the gravity has been the same for at least 2 days, we know that the yeast really isn't eating any more sugar. It's not making any more alcohol. It's basically done. We can taste the beer to make sure it doesn't have any off flavors. Sometimes the yeast can be done fermenting, but it's still got some flavors to clean up. Diacetyl being one of those. It's acetaldehyde. Yeast can kind of clean those flavors up if you just let it sit and do its thing. But when we're ready to cold crash, the tank has been fermenting at 70 degrees. We need to get it cold. Did Derek talk about glycol?
I do not recognize that word.
All right.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
the way we get our tanks, the way we control our tank temperatures, because in the middle of the summer it's 100 degrees in here.
Oh, yeah, no, he did talk about how hot it gets. Yes.
Yeah. So glycol is a food grade sugary liquid.
Okay.
We have a giant piece of machinery outside called our glycol chiller. It's like a 120, 130 gallon reservoir, and it keeps glycol has a very, very low freezing point. So we keep the temperature of our glycol in like 25 degrees below freezing. Not below freezing, sorry. 25 degrees, which is below freezing.
Yeah.
So that glycol chiller that glycol runs through all these lines up top.
Oh, cool.
All those insulated lines.
Yeah.
There's chilled glycol running through those to these tanks. And if a tank gets above the fermentation temperature we have it set for, it'll open valves that allows glycol to come in. These are double walled. So behind this piece, this layer of stainless is glycol. And then there's another layer of stainless. And then the beer is on the inside.
Gotcha.
So we're sending
So you're
cold
pumping
things.
it in,
Yep,
yeah.
yep. It's kind of like the Yeti coolers.
Yeah.
The
That's what I was just thinking. It's like
Yep, yep.
insulated, yeah.
Exactly. So when we send glycol to the tank, it can keep it in that fermentation range we need, or we can cold crash it. We set the temperature of the tank to whatever we want. So when we cold crash, we crash down to 33 degrees. That will, if fermentation is already done, so we're crashing it down to 33 so that we can get all of the yeast to fall out. The colder we get it, the more clarity we're gonna get from our beers, and the more we can get solids to drop out. So we'll cold crash the tank to 33 degrees. Sometimes we let it sit there for a few days, just kind of let everything fall out. Some days we will, or some beers we will immediately start carbonating. It just kind of depends on what our schedule looks like. But once we get down to 33 degrees, we can start carbonating. With carbonation, the way that it used to happen, like forever ago, you could, if you're fermenting in like a wooden barrel, they close the barrel off. As it's producing that CO2 and it's a closed environment, that CO2 goes into solution.
Like this, but within, so
So-
not letting this out.
Yep. So while this is fermenting, if we close this, it's going to build up pressure.
Just seems dangerous.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's not. It's like it's gonna go.
Depends.
Yeah.
You know, these hold
Yeah.
a lot of pressure.
Yeah. Okay.
But the more CO2 that's trapped in that tank, the more that will go into the solution. So we can close tanks off early and try to capture some of that natural CO2,
Yeah.
as opposed to pumping our own CO2 in there to carbonate it. And that's one thing we can do. It kind of saves us on CO2. It can shorten the process a little bit. But with carbonation, that's not going to get us all the way there by closing the tank off most of the time. So we've got the tank closed off, we've got a cold crash, we want to carbonate it. This is called it's our carb stone.
Okay.
So it's a very porous, long, it's like a pumice stone kind of.
Okay. Sure.
Yeah, so it's got a lot of tiny holes.
Uh-huh.
So we can send CO2 in, it goes into the stone, and as it comes out of the stone, the bubbles
Go through
become
all the
smaller.
little
They become
hole-
smaller.
Oh, okay.
So they go into solution easier.
Ah.
So we'll run CO2 into the tank. We usually run, I like to do what we call 30-30-30. We run at a certain pressure for 30 minutes, we'll up it, run for another 30 minutes, we'll up it again, run it for another 30 minutes. That usually gets us to where we want to be in carbonation range. And we'll use a piece of equipment called a Nagel.
You made that. You just made that up.
No, yeah, I wish.
Yeah.
It's very expensive, but you got to have it to check the carbonation. Nagel is obviously it's the guy's name that created.
Gotcha.
Everybody calls it a Nagel.
Okay.
So the way we'll check solution, we'll grab our Nagel. We hook it up to our Zwickel. There's another fun word for you.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
Maybe that one up too. But we'll hook our Nagel up to our Zwickel. We'll run beer through the Nagel.
Yeah.
Close it off. And we open a valve on our Nagel that allows, like the CO2 that's in solution, it'll allow it to expand. So once the beer is in the Nagel, you shake it for 30 seconds. You can look at the gauges on your Nagel. It'll show you a pressure and a temperature.
Okay.
So the colder the beer and the higher the pressure, usually the more carbonation you'll have. So there's a chart back here. You can probably see it on the wall.
Okay. Oh, I see it. Yeah.
So that shows us.
CO2 volume chart.
Yep, exactly. How can you read that from here?
Excellent eyes. I eat a lot of carrots.
Mine are terrible.
Yeah. I drink a lot of Mirror Twin beer.
Mine are terrible. So that carbonation chart, the left side will show you a temperature. The top will show you pressure. So we take our pressure and our temperature reading from our Zammernagel, and we find that spot on the chart. That tells us our carbonation level. We shoot for 2.5 volumes of CO2. That's relatively standard. There are some styles you want higher, some styles you want lower. Stouts, we shoot for 2.2. So not as much carbonation. Makes them feel a little creamier, a little thicker that way too. Hefeweizens and ciders, some lagers too. You can shoot for a little higher carbonation. It can give off a little cleaner. It can also accentuate hops. The more CO2 that's in solution, as you're drinking a beer, you know, some of that's still coming out, and it releases some of the hop aromas too. So the carbonation is another way to affect the mouthfeel and the aroma and the flavor of a beer, even though CO2 is tasteless.
Yeah.
So carbonation. Okay, once we're done carbonating, we get it to where we want. We're gonna package the beer. So we do two forms of package, kegs and cans.
Yeah. The canning stuff over here. Show us canning.
Cool.
I want to see. We're at 50 right now? Okay. Gotcha.
This is basically the last step up. So
No. This is great. I mean, there's so much to it. There has to be.
So two forms of package that we do, cans and kegs. We don't do bottles. We used to. It's tedious. It's labor intensive. And most people want cans. They're easy to deal with. You can recycle them a lot easier. And,
Sure.
So kegs, we will come out of the tank. We'll run through hoses all the way to our kegs. We were kegging earlier today. This is our keg filler. We can fill 4 kegs at a time. And we can fill them in half barrels or 6 barrels. The half barrel is the larger standard size keg. It's 15.5 gallons. The 6 barrel is 5.2 gallons. A lot of bars and restaurants that have like the behind the bar coolers with the taps on top.
Yeah.
They prefer those 6 barrels because they fit in there a lot better.
Sure.
Half barrels are obviously, you know, it's just like the more you buy, the cheaper it gets. Half barrels are what most people prefer. So we fill a lot of half barrels. But
Can you buy directly just from you guys? Like if I was
As a
having a
consumer?
party? Yeah. Yeah, I can just call up and be like, I want a keg.
Absolutely.
It's good to know.
And I'm the person you talk to.
Oh, fantastic. Oh, great.
So kegs are pretty straightforward.
Yeah.
Derek's back here washing kegs today. They get cleaned and they get pressurized with CO2. So when we're carbonated in the tank, we try to keep the tank somewhere between 12 and 15 psi. And that keeps the CO2 in solution so we don't lose any carbonation. Our kegs are kept around 10 so that when we're moving from the tank to the keg, the liquid wants to go to the lower pressure system.
Okay, sure.
So we'll push CO2 into our tanks. That'll push the beer out also. And when we're going into a keg, we have a blow-off or a bleeder valve that lets pressure out of the keg. So you're pushing pressure this way, you're releasing pressure over here. The liquid moves from our tanks into our kegs using counter pressure fill. So with the pressure on the kegs, it'll keep the CO2 in solution as well. So if there was no pressure on that keg, and we just sent beer in there full speed, it'd foam up. It's like pouring a beer like super fast, as opposed to pouring it super slow.
Well, and I'm remembering this from my college days, but when you first open up a keg to get it going, it's tons of foam, right? Because that's all going like towards the top. Is that the same-ish concept?
Yeah, some.
I'm just
some.
trying to throw something out that I know about foam. Yeah.
Temperature has a lot to do with it too.
Okay.
The warmer the beer is, the more it's going to foam up.
How many keg stands have you done in your life?
Ooh. Yes.
Love it. Okay, great.
More than I
Correct
probably,
answer. Correct answer. Yeah. I really feel like it's a dying art form. Like, you don't hear about this
I don't hear about much anymore.
with the undergrads at UK. Like, I deal with them a lot.
Yeah.
Yeah, and you just don't hear about.
Really?
Yeah, you don't hear about like keg stands.
It's because they're all drinking seltzers.
I probably. Yeah. Hell in a handbasket. This
Yeah.
Gen Z situation. Go on. Sorry. Tell me about canning.
Seltzers.
Seltzers.
Canning. So, when we started, we were obviously just doing draft beer. We did not can anything until 3-4 years in, maybe. And we did not have a canning line. We had, oh man, now I can't even remember. Did we can before COVID or after COVID? Derek! Did we can before COVID?
The same one we did.
Before COVID though, right?
Right as COVID.
Okay.
Who remembers anything about canning?
That's like,
blame you
yeah,
at all.
it's
What he was saying earlier, he was like, people really like to drink during the pandemic.
Ironheart.
Ironheart,
Yeah.
We used Ironheart, and then also.
That was before COVID though, right?
Yeah. And then we had the October Steamer.
Yep. Okay.
Yeah, we used to like do it by order, where people would fill the cans, where the bartenders would fill the cans and seam them.
That was first?
Yeah.
We did that first? Okay.
Yeah, we were just using those generic black labels. And
Yeah,
we
yeah.
would just write them by hand.
I don't remember what I did last week.
Yeah. Well,
That was a long time ago.
I remember that. I've
Those
seen
were
those.
the dark days. We
Yeah.
choose not to remember.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
How dare you
But-
bring them back up?
So before we did Ironheart, because I remember Andy came in to help us. We did.
Bashir?
No, that would have been cool.
That would have been really cool.
He'd been like, "This stinks. I'm
Yeah.
not closing you guys down."
Yeah.
Um,
Everyone but you.
you get an exemption. This
Yes.
is tough.
Tough. Tough times.
No, my buddy Andy. So we kind of wanted to feel it out before bringing Ironheart in, and so we did 100 cans of Hazy But Lazy from the tap, where like we were just like putting the cans in sanitizer and then purging them.
It's very labor intensive, like what homebrewers would do.
Mm-hmm.
And then like we were hand applying the labels, and it went really well. So we decided to bring Ironheart in. But you know, you can only can, like they're only there for a certain amount of time, and there was a minimum you had to can. But after a certain point, they charged you more for different brands. It's kind of like, you know, damned if you do, damned if you don't. But so we would normally do 3 different brands to hit their minimum or go a little bit above it, so you weren't charged extra. And then we would release those cans once a month, and that went really well. COVID happened. Selling beer in cans was the only way we could do it, and so
Or growlers.
that's when
I forget about growlers.
Everybody does.
we bought. Yeah, well, and growlers are just not a very efficient way of doing it.
They have the coolest name, though.
Would you like to have 4 beers at once? Because you will.
Yeah. Yeah.
Or you know, the beer will go bad.
Yeah.
It's funny to me though. There are still people who come in, or like, there's a 4-pack of Mos Def right there, and they're like, "No, I want a growler," because they have this perception that the beer, they're like, beer off tap tastes better, and that's why they still get growlers. It's like it's the exact same beer. Like we literally can it, and then right after we can it, it goes into kegs. There's no difference, but I think with some bigger breweries there probably is. Like it's either more carbonated, or they might add stabilizers to it so it's more shelf stable. But I mean, I don't know, you know, for a fact. But so we did that, and then we bought this little express fill machine. It was also very labor intensive. It was called Can Newton, and then we just seamed by hand. And then finally I was like, we can't keep doing this. So then we bought our first canning line, and there was a 3-head filler. And then when we moved over here, I realized we were gonna send a lot more beer out in distribution, and so that's when we bought our 10-head filler. And I'm really glad we did, because it would be very difficult for us to keep up with what we're putting out now with the original canning line we bought. But that's pretty much the history of us getting into that form of packaging. It's funny because when we first started, I was like, we're never canning. It's stupid. You know, like you got to pay for the can, the lid, the label, the 4-pack.
But it's worth it.
Well, yeah, I found out it was because now people have one. You go onto store shelves, and it kind of is like advertising, right? And then also, as you grow, you get to a point where you're making all this beer. You can't sell all of it out of your tap room.
Yeah.
Before it gets too old. So then you kind of have to send it out onto store shelves. And so it's funny how things change.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, but I really like that you're going into this business thinking one thing, but like as it grows, like you're adapting too.
Yeah,
Like you
you
want
have
it
to.
to grow. Yeah, you have to, right? Yeah.
If you want it to be successful.
Yeah. Of course.
I mean, even with beer styles, a lot of brewers, there are certain styles that they don't like or don't want to make. And you have to realize, it's a business too. And, if the general public likes that.
Totally. For your consumers, yeah.
And it's the same thing with, like what we talked about earlier with, having a full liquor license. You just have to realize that, not everyone likes beer, and there's nothing wrong with that. And so we just always have that mentality, and, we do a lot of things traditionally, but sometimes we throw 100 candy bars in the beer. So.
What candy bar?
What was that?
Yes.
Yeah.
100.
Yes.
What was it? 101.
We've done Snickers.
1,000 grand?
Huh?
Or 100 grand?
Remember when we did the 84?
Oh, 82 nutty bars on a keg.
Yeah, 82 nutty bars walk into a keg is what we called it. And we literally put 82 nutty bars into a beer.
I love it. No, but speaking of peanut butter, so tell me about when do you add the peanut, or like how do you get that peanut butter taste in you mean Mr. PB?
So we actually use a food grade extract.
Okay. I didn't know if you were like walking across the street to Jif or not.
Yeah, we tried that.
Mr. Smuckers was like, no.
So peanut butter, is very fatty, and so when you try to add it to beer, it is kind of difficult. So the extract is a food grade extract. I would say most breweries that have peanut butter beers use something to that extent. And actually, it says it's not allergenic. So I don't know if there are actually peanuts used or if somehow in the process they extract the allergen.
So my son has a peanut allergy, and so he can still have peanut oil because from whenever they make the oil, it separates the protein. So that might be what's happening with this too. So he can still have chips that have been like fried in that, and it's like he won't have a reaction to that. So it must be what it is with which is good to know.
Yeah.
No allergy issues here.
I'm not 100% sure it's an accurate representation of
So come on down.
He's like, this is what peanut butter tastes?
Pretty close.
That is pretty close.
It's like what grape flavor.
Yeah.
What is grape flavor doesn't taste like
No,
grape.
definitely
Banana
not.
flavor
But it's
doesn't taste like
delicious.
banana.
No, it does
Blue
not.
Raspberry?
Yeah.
Have you ever seen a blue raspberry? They don't exist.
They don't
It's
exist.
a made up
I've
flavor.
seen
Don't
pictures of them.
I love it. Okay. I think this is good. This is really good. And there's so much more science to all this than I mean, I walked in and knew that obviously this was like a huge process, but the amount of numbers and scientific terms that have been thrown at me today, mind-boggling.
Made a lot
All
of
for
words up.
beer.
Yeah, all words are made up. Take
Yeah, exactly. Especially the ones towards the end there that you were mentioning.
We do things so frequently and so often that the science we've kind of
Becomes like ingrained.
yeah.
Totally.
So most of the time we're trying to figure out logistics of moving things from here to here. We've got our science dialed in. We don't have to worry about it as much. We try to keep everything repetitive.
Yeah.
Not in a bad way, but
Yeah,
just,
yeah.
the more you do it, the more
Systematic.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So
for sure.
the less variables that
course.
change,
Yeah.
less science you have to worry about.
Love
Just
it.
keep up with it though.
And that's how you make a consistent product. And as you grow, when we first started, and I think craft inherently has a little bit of this where you get a little leeway. And people know like, well, this product might not taste exactly the same every time. But the larger you get, the more that's expected. Where
Oh, I'm sure.
your flagship beers, if they don't taste exactly the same every time, then people will notice.
But I guess people don't really realize. I mean, it depends on where hops are even grown, like you were saying, and like
Year to year,
what
hops
the
taste
crop
different.
was like
Yeah.
that year. Yeah, exactly. So
And
it's
like
like
I
a
said,
living
you
thing.
give the same ingredients and the same recipe to 10 breweries and they'll all taste the same.
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, you mean different?
No, sorry. You give the same recipe and the same grains and the same hops to 10 different breweries. They brew it the exact same way. it'll taste different at every
Yeah.
brewery.
Oh, sure.
So
Well, and then another thing too is like the really big breweries, they have such massive buying power that they get to like show up at the farm and say, this is the crop we want because this is going to make our beer taste exactly the same. We don't have that luxury. You know, we kind of get what's left over in a sense. Not saying that it's not as good.
Yeah.
It's just not as consistent.
Yep.
And so like Citra is a very popular hop and it sometimes tastes different from 2022 to 2023. Most people may not perceive that difference, and sometimes the difference doesn't come out depending on how you use it. But for the most part, you know, it will have a slight difference. And you know, as a brewery that, you know, we produce about 3,000 barrels a year, as opposed to larger breweries that produce 50,000. Then you get up into the millions of barrels. We just cannot achieve that level of consistency for that reason alone. We still try, but it's kind of impossible when you don't have control over every part of the product that goes into it.
Fair enough. Yeah. Okay, we're going to end with this because there was a question earlier from myself. The name White Girl Wasted. Where did it come from? Is it one girl?
No.
Okay.
So when I was in college, I was in a fraternity, and we would always joke when one of our buddies had a little too much, when they'd be like, let's go to Taco Bell or let's go to Jack in the Box, because they had those where I grew up. And we'd be like, oh man, Tim is so white girl wasted. And so it was kind of a colloquialism that we used at my college to describe, you know, people who
Just taking it too far.
you know, well, maybe not too far, but like I feel like there's a level of beer you have to drink to want Jack in the Box.
or Waffle House
To
at 3 o'clock in the
willingly.
morning.
Yeah.
Hey, listen, Waffle House is a perfectly good sober experience.
Sure
Like,
is.
my 6-year-old wants to go to Waffle House
All the time. Mine does too. What is it with
And I'm
6-year-olds?
like,
No.
okay,
Yes, go. All right, twist my arm. Yeah. I love that. So it's kind of for everyone, you know. It's like a euphoria, a
Yeah.
level of like, yeah, let's all attempt to be.
I mean, you know, I think for me, what I love about beer and what I've always loved about beer is I think it brings people together. And, you know, you grab beers with your friends because, you know, you're talking about your day or what's going on in your life. And I've always really loved that aspect of it. And so I love the fact that when I hang out at the brewery in the tap room, you see that happening. And I think that's why people love craft beer, and that's why we're social creatures, and beer brings people together, and I love that fact.
I love that. Why do you love beer?
Me personally, I like the creative aspect of it. There's thousands and thousands of different beers. Untapped it's an app on your phone where you can track the beers that you've had.
Yes.
That got me.
I've heard of this.
That got me into craft beer. Not just that alone, but it helped progress. Because there's so many things to track. They're all different flavors. There's a flavor for everybody. People that say they don't like beer, I said you just haven't had the right one. Mm-hmm. There are beers that don't taste like beer. There are beers that taste like they're 7 beers in the same glass. Yeah. So, you know, I like the variety and the creative aspect of it.
It's awesome.
Plus, after a 22-ounce bomber of a
14% barrel-aged stout.
you feel better.
Yeah.
Barrel-aged
It's
stouts.
medicine.
Yeah.
They are my favorite.
It's medicine.
Yeah.
Thank you both so much.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Yeah, this has been enlightening. I like it. Yeah. This is great.
Luckily, we weren't attacked by bees.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, thank goodness. Well, you could have just like put them in, you know, like with the Lexmark beer. Yeah, could have start making the honey right out here.
He did ask him to come pick him up.
Yeah.
I was like, can you come take these bees? They're
Love
not
it.
behaving.
I love it.
Jesus.
They're not sweet enough. Yeah. Dad joke.
That's my favorite pastime.
Love it.
Good.